The ambulance had already pulled away by the time I stepped out of my truck, but its red glow still clung to the pavement like something ashamed to leave. Snowflakes drifted in slow spirals, catching the hospital lights before melting on my sleeves. There was a strange quiet to the place, the kind that doesn't soothe you, just reminds you how alone you are in a moment you didn't plan for. I walked toward the entrance booths, echoing against the concrete. Inside, the warmth felt wrong, too sudden, too bright, as if the building was trying to hide what it really held. A nurse pushed past me with a stack of forms, and a pen clattered off her clipboard, skittering across the floor. She didn't bother picking it up. Nobody does when they're racing the clock. The hallway spread out in front of me, long and pale, humming with machines and muffled voices. Somewhere down that corridor, my father was lying in a bed he never wanted, surrounded by strangers, deciding things he had no strength left to argue about. And behind one of those doors, a woman I barely knew was making choices that felt far too urgent to belong to anyone but family. There's a moment every man can feel when the ground under him shifts a fraction small enough to miss if he isn't paying attention. But I felt it there in that sterile light. Something was being set in motion, and I had walked in just late enough to sense it, but not late enough to ignore it. I moved deeper into the corridor, the cold still clinging to my boots, and the air felt heavier with every step. I walked into the hospital with dust still clinging to my boots, the kind that settles on you after hours inspecting a foundation that refuses to cooperate. The air inside was colder than the January wind outside, a mix of disinfectant and recycled air humming through old ceiling vents. I followed the hallway toward my father's room, passing nurses who moved with the quiet urgency only hospitals can teach. I tried not to think about the call that dragged me here, the one saying my father needed to update his will and that it could not wait. Calls like that never come when life is steady. They come when something beneath your feet has already begun to shift. My father lay on the bed with his eyes half open, a soft line of oxygen running across his cheeks. His face looked thinner than I remembered, more fragile, but his eyes still carried the stubborn spark I grew up with. He used to look at broken engines the same way, searching for the one piece that betrayed the whole. Martha stood beside him, one hand resting on the rail of the bed, the other holding a clipboard pressed to her chest. She turned toward me with a practiced smile, the kind you see on someone who already knows the answer they want from you. Her voice was smooth when she told me the doctors needed paperwork signed to make sure my father's wishes were followed. She said it gently, almost kindly, and then lifted the clipboard toward me. The papers flipped enough for me to catch the edge of a line with my name printed on it. I stepped closer, feeling the weight of every unspoken expectation in the room. My father watched me, not blinking. There was something in his stare that made my breath slow. I reached for the pen, not because I trusted the situation, but because years of dealing with contractors and clients had conditioned me to move first and think after. Sometimes that habit helps, sometimes it blinds you. The moment the pen brushed my fingers, my father's hand rose from the blanket. The movement came slow, but with intention. His fingers closed around my wrist, cold but sure. He whispered my name, barely more than a breath, and then said what he needed to say. "Do not sign, check the camera, wooden cabinet." His voice faltered on the last word, and the grip on my wrist loosened, but the warning hung between us like dust caught in a beam of light. I did not answer right away. I just looked at him, trying to understand why a man who hated anything with batteries would suddenly trust a camera more than the person standing beneath his bed. Martha let out a soft laugh, the kind meant to smooth over awkward moments. She told me he had been confused, that the medication and the stress of being in the hospital had been playing tricks on his memory. She said it as if she had said it many times before. Then she added that I knew my father better than anyone, and that if he wanted something done, he would want it done clean and simple. Her words were calm, but something in her eyes shifted when I lowered the clipboard instead of signing it. A small tension settled around her mouth, not anger, just a flicker of impatience. I told her I would take the papers home and look through them. She nodded, but the nod lacked warmth. I knew the gesture from job sites, the silent acknowledgement, when someone realizes they no longer control the timeline. I stayed a few more minutes with my father. He placed his hand over mine, barely pressing, but the gesture felt like a man holding on to the last bit of truth he could still control. I thought about the years between us, the distance that had grown without either of us naming it out loud. There were things in my life I had looked away from before, things that cost more than I should have allowed. Standing there beside him, I felt the echo of those mistakes pressing against my ribs. When I left the room, the hallway felt different. A janitor pushed a cart past me. A nurse laughed softly with another at the end of the corridor. Life went on with the steady rhythm of a place built to withstand bad news. Yet something in my world had tilted and I had no name for it yet. The walk back to the parking lot felt longer than it should have. The wind carried a faint whistle across the concrete. I reached my truck and sat inside without starting the engine. My hand shook slightly when I rested it on the steering wheel, just enough for me to notice. The hospital windows reflected a dull light through the windshield. I watched them until my breath settled. I turned on the dome light and looked at my fingers, still remembering the cold urgency in my father's grip. He had not asked me to bring him water or to call my sister or to get the doctors. He had asked me to check a camera. The request did not match the man I knew, which meant something had changed, something deeper than his illness. I pulled the keys from my pocket and started the truck, letting the engine settle into its low rumble. Outside the windshield, a thin layer of snow had begun to fall, drifting through the beam of the streetlight like ash. It reminded me of insulation dust floating inside the houses I inspect, the kind that signals a cavity behind the walls. Hidden damage, slow rot, trouble you only see when you look for it. As I pulled out of the parking lot, the question followed me with quiet persistence. Why would my father, a man who trusted his own hands more than any device, put his faith in a camera? The thought stayed with me on the empty road, steady and uninvited, like the first warning crack in a wall you always wished you had seen sooner. The snow followed me home like a second shadow, drifting across the windshield in slow, pale waves. By the time I turned into my father's neighborhood, everything looked softer under the winter dark, but not warmer. The houses sat low against the wind, familiar but distant, as if I had stepped into a memory instead of a street I had driven down 1,000 times. His bungalow stood exactly as it always had, single-story, narrow porch, the garage leaning a little from years of Midwestern storms. I shut off the engine and let the quiet settle before opening the door. The cold hit hard as I stepped out, sharper than it had felt at the hospital, and the porch light flickered as if unsure whether to guide me in or warn me off. Inside, the scent was the first thing that reached me. Oil, old coffee, a hint of sawdust from projects he never finished. It was the smell of my childhood and all the years after, but something in it felt hollow, now stretched thin by the absence of his presence. I closed the door and listened to the house breathe. I walked through the living room, passing the recliner where he used to fall asleep with the television still glowing. The cross my mother hung years ago still leaned slightly to the left. Every detail sat exactly where he left it. Yet the air held a kind of tension, like the stillness in a home after a storm passes but before anyone dares open the windows. His study waited at the end of the hallway. The desk lamp was off, but enough light seeped through the doorway for me to see the chair pulled out, the stacks of papers arranged with the care of a man who trusted order more than time. I stepped inside, my boots pressing into the carpet he refused to replace even when the color faded. The wooden cabinet sat against the far wall. I stood in front of it with my hand on the handle, remembering the last time I opened it. I had been looking for a wrench he insisted he could not find. Now opening it felt like crossing a line he had drawn for me without saying a word. Inside were the usual things, tax folders, bills he kept longer than any man needed to. Letters my mother wrote to him in the early years. I moved them aside carefully, as if disturbing them might erase something important. My fingers brushed against a cardboard edge tucked in the back. I pulled out a shoebox and set it on the cabinet. The lid felt too light in my hands. When I removed it, a small black device rested on a folded writ, the kind he kept in the garage for wiping grease. The camera looked almost fragile against the worn cloth. A strip of tape clung to the side with words scribbled in handwriting that time had bent and softened. Living room. I sat on the edge of the desk chair holding the camera for a long moment. I remembered standing right here months ago, showing him how a simple device could reassure him after that break-in down the block. He nodded like he always did when he thought I was fussing too much. Part affection, part stubborn independence. I never saw him take another step toward it. Yet here it was, labeled in his hand. A part of me tightened, the part that still believed he would always be stronger than he looked. I wondered when he stopped telling me things, or if he had tried and I had not listened closely enough. I carried the shoebox to the kitchen. The bulb over the sink cast a lonely circle of yellow against the dark. I set the laptop on the table, connected the camera, and waited. The device was old enough that the first seconds of footage appeared grainy, the audio faint and uneven. It added a rawness I did not expect, like hearing someone breathe on the other side of a wall. Then the image settled into focus. My father's living room filled the screen, the recliner, the blanket draped over the armrest, the faint outline of afternoon light stretching across the carpet. Even in the washed-out footage, I could see the ridge in the floor where the boards had warped from age. A familiar ache rose in my chest. The room stayed empty for a few seconds before movement slid in from the right. Martha entered, her posture different from the hospital, more certain. The camera angle caught her profile as she scanned the room with a practiced eye. A moment later, a man stepped in behind her. Taller, broader, wearing a coat heavy enough for the cold but left open as if he owned the space. She called him Derek. Hearing her voice in that room made something inside me tense. They stood close, bodies angled toward each other the way people do when they share a secret. Martha lifted a clipboard, the same style she tried to place in my hand hours earlier. Derek leaned over her shoulder and pointed at something under the top sheet. I paused the video and leaned closer to the screen. A folded document peeked out from beneath the page's edges, slightly worn as if handled multiple times. I zoomed in, adjusting the angle, but the camera resolution blurred the details. Still, I saw enough to know it was not paperwork from any hospital form I had ever seen. I let the footage play. Their voices came through with a low hiss, broken by static, but the tone carried unmistakable intent. They rehearsed sentences about medical consent and legal necessity, repeating lines as if preparing for a performance. The way Martha held the board, the practiced swing toward the viewer, the timing of her pauses. It was all too smooth, too exact, as if she had done it before. At one point, Derek stepped closer to the camera's blind side, and for a moment his face tilted toward the lens. His expression showed no hesitation, only calculation. It chilled me more than I expected. The video wavered when Martha shifted, a quick jerk of the screen, then stabilized. The audio dipped and crackled. It gave the entire scene a raw, uneasy authenticity that made my stomach tighten. The living room I grew up in felt violated, as if their presence had soaked into the walls. When the footage finally ended, I paused the frame where the empty living room reappeared, the chair sitting alone again. I stared at that stillness, thinking of my father sitting here labeling the camera with careful hands, knowing he might not be able to confront what he feared. He had prepared this quietly without telling me, without telling anyone. He set a trap because he knew no one else would believe him. I sat back in the kitchen chair. The house around me seemed to fold inward, the walls leaning closer as if waiting for me to understand the gravity of what I had seen. The clock near the refrigerator clicked softly, marking time with the calm disregard of something that had witnessed years pass without complaint. I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the table. The wood felt cool beneath my palms. Outside the window, snow brushed against the glass in uneven strokes. The wind carried a faint whistle, the same tone my father's breath made earlier that evening when he warned me. I stood slowly and walked back through the hallway. The shadows from the kitchen light stretched long across the carpet, reaching toward the study. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The cabinet stood open, the space where the shoebox had been, leaving a dark shape against the wall. The air felt tighter there, as if the house itself understood what I had uncovered. I switched off the light, letting the room fall completely into shadow. The darkness seemed deeper than before, not threatening, just honest. I stood for another moment, letting the quiet press against me, then stepped back into the hall as the snow drifted softly against the windows and the house settled into its long, waiting silence. I stood in the hallway for a while, letting my eyes adjust to the dark, listening to the house settle. Somewhere in the walls, the old furnace kicked on a low rumble that moved through the floorboards and into my feet. The snow brushed against the windows in soft, steady strokes. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath. Back in the kitchen, the laptop waited on the table, its black screen reflecting the single light above the sink. I walked toward it with the same slow care I use when I step onto a floor I am not sure will hold my weight. I sat down, woke the screen, and the frozen last frame of the living room stared back at me. The empty chair, the faint blur where they had stood. My hand moved to the trackpad more from instinct than intention. I closed the video file, and the folder behind it opened wider rows of tiny icons lined up like a timeline I had not known existed. One of them carried a different date. I frowned and leaned closer. The timestamp stamped into the file name was from 2 nights ago, not from the afternoon when Martha and Derek rehearsed their lines. The night before, I got the call to come sign. A quiet pressure built inside my chest, slow but firm. I clicked it. The image that came up was darker and more jagged, the kind of grainy you get when a cheap lens struggles with bad lighting. The camera must have been half covered by cloth edges, blurred and gray. Still, certain things cut through. A hospital bed rail, a plastic water pitcher, the faint pattern of the curtain that had hung around my father's bed when I walked in that day. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, I saw my father's coat slung over a chair. Same one he always wore in winter brown canvas with fraying at the cuffs. I pictured him slipping the camera into the pocket when they brought him in, an old man pretending to be more helpless than he was. For a few seconds there was only the hiss of the room, that recorded silence filled with tiny sounds. Air moving through a vent, a cart rolling somewhere down the hall, the distant beep of some machine keeping score of a stranger's life. Then Martha's voice came into focus, closer than the picture suggested. She sounded like she was standing right beside the camera. "Let me get you some privacy," she said, her tone warm, almost soothing. The footage jolted a little as something heavy brushed against the lens. The view shifted, and all I could see was fabric, a muted pattern of squares and faint colors. I realized she must have yanked the curtain around the bed, blocking the hospital ceiling camera in the process. A normal gesture in any other context. Here, paired with what I had seen in my father's house, it carried a different weight. The sound of the curtain hooks sliding along the rail scraped through the speakers, then settled. The world on the other side of that thin layer of cloth went quiet. Her voice lost its padding. "All right, Harold," she said, more clipped now, less gentle. "We need to get this done." I heard the soft thump of something placed on the bed. Paper shifted, the slight click of plastic, maybe a pen being snapped open. My father's breath came through, faintly raspy but steady. "What is it?" he asked, his voice weaker than when I had heard him that afternoon, but still clear enough. "Consent for your treatment," she answered without hesitation. "The hospital needs it. If you do not sign, they cannot move forward. You want to get better, do not you?" There was a pause. His breathing sounded louder for a moment, like he was trying to gather whatever was left of his strength. "Does Evan know?" he asked. The question landed in me like a stone dropped into cold water. She answered before he finished the second word. "He is busy. Do not drag him into this. You want him burdened with all this legal stuff." The way she said my name, not angry, just dismissive, twisted something tight inside me. I could not see her face, but I could hear the shape of her mouth in her words, efficient, certain, like she was cleaning up a mess. More paper rustled. The microphone picked up the sound of it being pushed closer to him, or maybe folded back. So only one line waited for ink. There was a long breath and a soft grunt, the kind you hear when someone tries to lift something heavier than they should. My hand tightened on the edge of the table. I know that sound, the soft scratch of a pen moving over paper. Years of watching contractors sign off on inspections, homeowners' initial changes. They did not fully understand people committing themselves to structures that were not as sound as they believed. There is a rhythm to it, a particular scrape when a signature begins with hesitation and ends with resignation. "Come on now." Her voice came again, flattened of any concern we do not have all day. "Just sign where I showed you." The audio crackled, breaking the next seconds into fragments. A cough. The faint creak of the bed frame, the pen skittering once as if it slipped, then finding its groove again. "I cannot see the page," I whispered to myself. The cloth blocked the picture entirely now. But I did not need to see it. Every fiber in my body knew what kind of line she was pointing to. Another noise entered the recording, faint but different. The squeak of a shoe on polished floor. A quick intake of breath that did not belong to my father. Maybe a nurse standing just outside the curtain, maybe nothing. The camera did not show me, it only let me hear the edges of a moment I had already missed. "Is this really for the doctor?" My father asked, the words pushed out with effort. "Or is this for you?" For a heartbeat, there was no response. Then her voice came back lower with a thin layer of irritation. "It is so your son does not have to deal with all the financial details when you are gone. I am trying to help you. Let me." He did not answer. The silence stretched. The pen tapped against the board, a soft, impatient beat. "You trust me, do not you?" she said. The recording blurred with static right after that, as if the camera itself flinched. When the sound cleared, the pen was moving again. A long scratch, then nothing. I paused the file. The kitchen light hummed overhead, the only constant sound in the room. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, features blurred by the faint glare. I looked like a man who had stumbled onto a scene halfway through and was trying to replay it from the beginning. My hand hovered over the trackpad, then I pressed play again. The final seconds carried only small, tired sounds. My father's breath slowing, the soft slide of the clipboard being lifted away. her weight shifting one foot then the other. "Good," she said, her voice almost cheerful again. "That was the hard part. Now you just rest." The curtain rings moved along the rail, a metallic clatter that felt too loud in the tiny speakers. Light must have returned to the room, but the camera remained pressed against cloth, blind and muffled. After a moment, footsteps faded. A door opened and closed. The room eased back into machine beeps and the low murmur of distant voices. I stopped the recording. The kitchen felt colder than before. The snow against the glass sounded like fingertips drumming a slow, steady rhythm. I sat there staring at the blank screen, the echo of my father's question looping in my head. Does Evan know? He had asked for me. She had pushed my name aside. The living room video had shown intent planning the private rehearsal of a lie. This recording did something else. It crawled into the space between vulnerability and trust, into the moment when a man, too weak to stand still, tried to stand his ground. I closed the laptop gently and let my hands rest on it for a while. My fingers were colder than they should have been. In the old days, when I found a load-bearing wall that had been cut by someone who did not understand its importance. I felt a similar weight. You know damage has been done. You know it will not reveal itself all at once. I turned off the kitchen light and the room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint orange glow from the stove clock. The house around me exhaled long and slow. Somewhere outside, a car passed its tires, whispering over slush, then faded into nothing. I stood and moved through the hallway by feel hand, brushing the wall where family photos hung. The faces were there in the dark, smiling versions of us that did not know about hospital curtains or hidden cameras, or the way someone could walk into your home and turn it into a stage. At the doorway to my father's bedroom, I paused. The bed was neatly made, the indentation of his pillow still visible. I walked in, sat on the edge, and let my shoulders drop. The quiet in that room felt different from the quiet in the kitchen. Closer, heavier. My father had slipped a camera into his coat and carried it into a hospital because he believed someone might try to rewrite his life when he could not fight back. He had trusted that if he left a trail, I would follow it. I listened to the radiator ticking as it cooled to the soft creaks of an old house adjusting to another cold night. Then I lay back on top of the covers, fully dressed, eyes on the ceiling in the dark, and let the weight of what I had heard settle over me like another kind of snow. Morning came in pieces. First as a pale strip of light pressing through the thin curtains, then as the dull ache in my back from sleeping on top of the covers, boots, still on one arm, thrown over my eyes. For a minute I did not move. The radiator ticked in the corner. Somewhere outside, a plow scraped against the street metal, dragging over packed snow. The sound pulled me back to the weight in my chest. I pushed myself up and sat on the edge of my father's bed. His pillow still held the shallow dip of his head. The room smelled faintly of his aftershave and the old laundry detergent he never bothered to change. I stared at the dresser across from me, at the neatly folded shirts, the watch he always wore resting in its usual place. All the small proofs of a life that someone had tried to sign away behind a curtain. By the time I reached downtown, the sky had turned a flat gray and the streets were lined with slush. I parked in a garage 2 blocks from Malone's office and walked the rest of the way, collar turned up against the wind. The building was an old brick structure, 4 stories, the kind of place that had survived more winters than anyone working inside it. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, partly out of habit, partly because I needed the time to steady my thoughts. Malone's office sat at the end of a narrow hallway, the door closed, his name printed in black on frosted glass. I knocked once and went in when I heard his muffled answer. Inside, the room was warm and smelled faintly of coffee gone lukewarm. Blueprints, survey maps, and property photos lined the walls. File boxes stacked neatly along one side, each one a container for someone else's troubles. He was behind his desk, glasses low on his nose, a legal pad in front of him. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment his expression softened the way it always did when he saw me. Then he noticed the laptop under my arm and the set of my jaw. "You look like hell," he said quietly. I set the laptop on his desk and sat down. It took me a second to find my voice. "It has been a long night." He nodded, no judgment in it, and turned the screen toward himself when I opened it. I pulled up the first video, the living room, and let it play. Martha entering my father's house with Derek at her shoulder, the clipboard, the folded document tucked beneath blank pages. Their low, rehearsed voices filled the quiet office. Malone leaned in slightly, elbows on the arms of his chair, hands together. The footage was grainy, the audio imperfect, but you did not need clarity to understand what you were seeing. You only needed eyes and a working sense of decency. When the video ended, I clicked to the second file, the hospital audio. I explained the timestamp, how it was recorded the night before Martha called the hospital and asked them to reach me. We listened to her draw the curtain to her voice hardening once the cameras above could no longer see. Heard my father's question. "Does Evan know?" Heard the way she stepped over it. By the time the recording finished, the room felt smaller. Malone sat back slowly and removed his glasses. He placed them on the desk, then steepled his fingers in front of his mouth. I had seen him handle zoning disputes, boundary line fights, probate arguments that broke families apart. I had never seen his jaw tighten the way it did now. He did not speak for a few seconds. Then he exhaled through his nose and looked at me. "This is not bad caregiving," he said. "This is a plan." I waited. The heating system hummed above us, the only sound in the room. He motioned to the screen with a small tilt of his head. "You have attempted manipulation of a will. You have a caregiver bringing an outsider into your father's home. You have them rehearsing false explanations for signatures. That is one. Then you have this," he said, tapping at the replay bar of the hospital audio. "The curtain pulled for privacy is normal. The rest of it is not. Pressuring an elderly man to sign something he does not understand one day before he supposedly decides he needs to change his estate." He paused, his gaze steady. "It walks like elder financial exploitation." It sounds like elder financial exploitation. That is what any investigator is going to see. I ran a thumb along the edge of the desk, feeling the small nicks in the wood. Part of me wanted him to tell me I had overreacted, that there was some benign explanation. He did not. "The audio will be the first thing they attack," I said. He nodded. "They will argue privacy in a medical setting, lack of consent for recording all of it. Standing alone in the recording could be a fight. But it does not stand alone, Evan. It stands next to the video in that living room. It stands next to any pattern we can find in your father's finances." He reached for his keyboard, pulled up a secure window, and motioned for the bank folder I had brought with me. I slid it across the desk, the envelope heavier than paper ought to be. He opened it and began sorting through the statements, his pen tracing certain lines. He circled several transactions and turned the page so I could see. "Withdrawals just under 10,000, spaced out, different branches. These are not accidental," he said. "Your father never made transfers like this before." "No," I answered. "He barely used online banking. Everything was checks and cash." Malone leaned back again, connecting invisible lines in his head. "In your work," he said, "you see certain patterns in bad builds, contractors cutting the same corner over and over, substituting cheaper material in non-obvious places. You know it when you see it." I nodded. "This," he continued, "is the money version of that. They are moving sums slow enough to avoid automatic reports, but steady enough to add up. We will need to match dates. See when she started. See if any of it overlaps with her employment and his decline. He picked up his legal pad and began writing short, precise lines, one under the other. Names, dates, offices to contact, departments that would need to be looped in. It was the sound of a plan forming, quiet but deliberate. "So what do we do first?" I asked. He looked up from the page, his eyes clear. "We protect your father," he said. "Then we protect his estate." He explained that he would file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services, attaching the video, the audio, and the bank records as supporting material. APS would open an investigation into Martha's conduct as a caregiver. At the same time, he would notify the hospital's legal department, not as an accusation against them, but as a heads up that one of their contracted workers might be involved in coercive behavior. "We also go to probate court," he said. "We petition for an order freezing any new changes to his will or estate planning until a capacity evaluation is done and until questions of undue influence are addressed. The court has seen cases like this before. They will recognize what we are bringing them." I listened, the names of agencies and courts lining up in my mind like streets on a map. Each one a place we would have to walk through before this was over. He paused, then added something more quietly. "We do not go to your father with all of this yet. Not like this. He needs care. He does not need the full weight of what has happened pressed onto his chest while he is still trying to breathe." A part of me bristled at that, a protective reflex, but I knew he was right. I remembered my father's hand on my wrist, the effort it took just to push out those words about the camera. He had already carried more than he should have. "You understand," Malone said. I nodded. He slid the legal pad to one side and looked at me. Not as a client now, but almost as he had when I was younger and sat in this same chair while my parents went over their own wills. He had watched me grow into this man, watched the lines form in my face, the gray creep into my hair. "This will not be quick," he said. "Once we start, there is no neat way to step back. Are you ready for that?" I thought of the footage in my kitchen of my father's voice, asking if I knew of Martha's practiced answers, Derek's easy posture in a house that did not belong to him. I thought of my own silence over the past months, the times I told myself the agency had vetted her, that my father was in good hands. "I am ready," I said. He believed me. I could tell in the way he did not ask again. He turned back to his computer, fingers moving with more purpose now, drafting the first of several documents that would carry my father's name into systems built to respond slowly but firmly. I watched the light from the window fall across his desk, catching on the frames of his glasses, the small flecks of dust in the air. It all felt suddenly heavier and more real than any blueprint I had ever reviewed. When the initial reports were done and the copies prepared, he placed a folder in front of me. "Keep this," he said. "It is for your records." The folder felt almost too light considering what it represented. I stood, thanked him, and we walked to the door together. In the hallway, the offices were quiet, most doors closed. The world outside our small orbit moved on, oblivious. "You call me if she contacts you," he said, "or if anything changes at the hospital. That includes the smallest thing." I agreed and stepped out into the stairwell. The echo of the door closing behind me followed me down the steps. On the sidewalk, the wind cut sharper than before, carrying the smell of exhaust and old snow. Traffic rolled past in slow lines, people on their way to lunches, meetings, lives that did not include hidden cameras or forged papers. I stood there for a moment with the folder under my arm, feeling its thin edge press against my side. We had crossed a line inside that office, moved from uneasy suspicion into something structured and official. Once you begin that kind of process, it has a life of its own. A bus rolled past, sending a spray of slush toward the curb. I stepped back just in time, the cold water missing my shoes by an inch, and watched the red lights vanish into the gray. Then I turned toward the garage, the folder held close, and let my steps carry me toward whatever waited next. The walk back to the garage felt longer than it should have. My boots echoed against the stairwell tiles, each step scraping through a quiet that had settled deep inside me. Outside, the gray afternoon had slipped toward evening, the sky low and heavy, the kind that presses on your shoulders without touching you. I breathed in the cold air and let it sting the back of my throat. It felt sharper than anything inside the office. Traffic murmured along the street. I crossed at the corner and unlocked my truck, the metal cold under my fingers. When I sat inside, the silence folded around me again, careful and patient. I rested my hands on the wheel and let them stay there until the tremor in my fingers eased. The folder Malone gave me lay on the passenger seat like a quiet verdict. The days that followed washed together in a slow tide. My inspections felt mechanical, my notes careful but empty. The houses I walked through all blurred, framing studs and concrete slabs, pipes and wiring. None of it sinking in the way it used to. My phone buzzed through lunch breaks and late evenings, calls from Malone, updates from APS, one nurse or another checking to confirm details for the file. I answered each one steady and flat, like a man working through a storm from the inside. Most days I ended at the hospital. The elevators always smelled faintly of bleach and the faint metallic tang of old machinery. I walked the same hallways until I reached his room sometimes, finding him asleep, sometimes awake, always tired. I sat beside him, letting the sounds of the monitors fill the spaces neither of us needed to speak into. And when I stepped out at night, the fluorescent lights left a hum in my head that followed me all the way to the stairwell. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the roofs across the street, I paused in that stairwell, phone already in my hand. I had been circling the same thought for days, waiting for it to settle into the shape of a decision. I scrolled until I found the number I had not used in years. Claire answered on the third ring. Her voice came cautious, the tone people use when they expect news they do not want. "Evan," she said. Her saying my name like that made something in my chest pull tight. I leaned against the concrete wall, breath fogging in the cold air drifting down from the top floor. "It is about Dad," I said. There was a pause. I heard movement, maybe a chair, maybe her brushing hair out of her face like she always used to. "What happened?" she asked. I told her. Not everything at once, not all the details that still felt too raw to hold in one hand. I told her about Martha, about the clipboard, about the footage in the living room, the hospital audio. I told her the things that mattered, the things she deserved to know. When I finished, the line went quiet. She breathed out slowly, a soft sound that carried more years than either of us had counted. Then she said, not accusing, not angry, just tired in a way I recognized. "You always handled things. I thought if I stayed away, at least I was not in the way." Her words hit harder than anything I expected. A quiet blow, not meant to hurt, but still landing where the foundation was already cracked. I pressed my palm to my forehead and closed my eyes. The stairwell felt smaller, the concrete walls drawing close like they had been waiting for this moment. For a long second, neither of us spoke. "I am not blaming you," she added, but the ache stayed anyway, settled between the ribs where old regrets like to live. I swallowed against it. "I will keep you updated," I said. "All right," she answered, her voice softer now. When the call ended, I lingered in the stairwell, the empty hum settling around me. Then I pushed through the door and stepped into the parking lot. The sodium lights overhead cast everything in that familiar orange haze, long shadows stretching across the pavement. I walked to my truck and climbed in, shutting the door with a hollow thud. For a moment I just sat there, hands loose in my lap. Through the windshield, the hospital windows glowed pale squares of white and yellow against the deepening dark. I imagined him somewhere inside, quieter than the machines beside him, fighting in ways I could not see. Derek's voice from the recording slid back into my mind. "If he does not sign, wait until he is out cold." The words crawled under my skin the way frost creeps across a windshield. Rage rose steady and hot, swelling in my chest until it pressed against my throat. I clenched the steering wheel and felt the tendons in my hand tighten. For a second, I pictured myself walking back inside, storming down those halls, saying the things anger wanted me to say. But anger is loud, and loud things break easily. Evidence holds. Paper holds. Truth holds. I loosened my grip and let the breath leave my lungs slowly, the way my father used to exhale after lifting something heavier than he should. Outside, a nurse crossed the lot toward her car, her steps quick, her breath forming small clouds in the air. The world kept moving, indifferent to what it was carrying. My phone buzzed. A text from Claire. "Keep me updated. If this goes to court, I will come." I stared at the message for a long moment. It was only a few words, but they carried something unfamiliar between us, something that felt like the beginning of a bridge rebuilt from old beams. I typed back a short acknowledgement, then pocketed the phone. The night had settled fully now, deep and wide, the kind of quiet that sinks into the spaces under your skin. I drove home slowly, letting the tires hum beneath me, letting the orange streetlights flicker past one by one. My father's house sat dark when I reached it. The porch light had burned out sometime during the day. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell of the place wrapping around me again. Warm in some ways, hollow in others. I hung up my coat, kicked off my boots, and walked into the kitchen. The mini camera sat on the table, the tape label faded but still legible. Living room. I pulled out the chair and sat down across from it. For a moment, neither of us moved, as if the object were another presence in the room, something that had witnessed more than it ever should have. I let my elbows rest on the table and lowered my head slightly, staring at the small device between my hands. It held a piece of the story, the part my father could not say aloud. The rest was still unfolding around us. Snow began to tap lightly against the kitchen window, a soft rhythm that settled into the quiet house. I listened to it and let the weight of the day sink deeper, not fighting it, not running from it, just sitting with it. When I finally stood, the chair legs scraped gently against the floor. I left the camera where it was unblinking on the table and walked toward the hallway, the darkness ahead of me. Stretching long and still, the house seemed to breathe once low and tired, as if it knew sleep would not come easily. The days that followed moved in a slow grind, each one starting and ending in my father's house. The space between taken up by job sites, hospital corridors, and calls from offices with names that sounded more official than human. At some point in that blur, the phone rang while I sat at his kitchen table with the camera still between us. Malone told me the hospital had agreed to a meeting with APS present. He gave me a date and time. My pen hovered over the notepad, but I did not need to write it down. It settled into me like a weight. A week after he filed the complaints, I found myself walking down a different hallway in the same hospital. No windows here, just beige walls and framed prints that looked bought in bulk. The floor had that polished shine that never quite hides the scuffs. A sign on the door at the end simply said, "Conference." I paused with my hand on the handle, feeling my pulse in the pads of my fingers, then pushed my way in. The room smelled of coffee and paper, that stale blend of meetings and decisions. A long table sat in the middle, its surface already scattered with folders and plastic water cups. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Malone sat near one end, glasses on a stack of documents in front of him. Across from him was a woman in a dark suit who had the look of a hospital attorney, her expression composed, eyes already weighing risk and liability. Next to her sat the medical director, his badge clipped to his shirt pocket, shoulders a little too stiff. At the far side of the table, a man from APS arranged his notes, his posture calm but steady. He had the kind of face that had seen too many versions of the same story and still showed up. An empty chair waited beside Malone. I took it. Martha arrived last, a few minutes after the hour. She wore her scrubs hair tied back, badge visible, the picture of a caregiver who had rushed over from a demanding shift. She apologized for being delayed, said something about covering for another nurse. Her eyes swept the room, quickly assessing, then settled on me for the briefest second before she sat opposite. No one spoke for a moment. The hum of the ventilation filled the gaps. The APS investigator began, his voice even. He explained that the meeting was part of a preliminary review, that this was not a court of law, but the information shared would guide what happened next. He nodded toward Malone, who gestured to my laptop placed at the center of the table. We started with the hospital recording. I had heard it already, every breath, every scrape of the pen. Hearing it here in a room filled with people who could actually do something changed the way it sat on my skin. The investigator pressed play, and the small speaker filled the space with the faint hiss of that hospital room, the rustle of the curtain. Martha's voice, bright at first, then sharper as she thought the cameras were gone. The words landed heavier in this setting. The attorney's pen stopped moving. The medical director shifted in his seat, a small movement but telling. When my father asked if I knew, when she answered that I was too busy and should not be dragged in. I felt the attorney looking at me from across the table, then looking away as if the air had grown a little thicker. Martha sat very still while the audio played. Her eyes stayed on the table, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Only when the recording reached the part where she urged him to sign did I see a twitch at the corner of her jaw. When the sound ended, the room fell into a quiet that was not quite silence. The investigator reached out and paused the file. The fluorescent hum returned to the front of my hearing. Martha was the first one to speak. Her voice came soft, shaken. She said my father had been confused, that he mixed up forms, that she was trying to help him navigate complicated paperwork. She mentioned his age, his medications, the stress of being in the hospital. At one point, her eyes grew glossy and she wiped at them with the back of her hand. He thought everything was about his will, she said. Breath-catching. I was only trying to make sure he got the treatment he needed. For a moment, listening to her, I felt a flicker of something I did not want to name. Not sympathy, but an awareness of how convincing she could be to someone who had not seen what I had seen. I wondered how many families believed this version, how many never knew there was another. The APS investigator let her finish without interruption. Then he turned to Malone. "You have additional evidence," he said. Malone adjusted his glasses and opened a folder with a practiced calm that I had come to recognize. He did not raise his voice or push. He simply laid out pieces of a structure he had already assembled in his mind. "We have footage from Mr. Mercer's home," he said. "The living room where my client's father lives. In it, Mrs. Ellison arrives with a man later identified as Derek Lane. They are seen preparing a clipboard, folding what appears to be a will or estate document beneath blank pages and rehearsing explanations for signatures involving medical consent." He slid printed still frames across the table. The attorney leaned forward and the medical director followed. Even in the grainy images, Martha and Derek were unmistakable, standing in a place that was not theirs, holding something they had no right to hold. "We also have bank records," Malone continued. "A pattern of withdrawals just under reporting thresholds beginning after Ms. Ellison was hired as caregiver. These are inconsistent with Mr. Mercer's prior financial behavior. He tapped the statements gently, then added another sheet. And there were notes found in a locked room in Mr. Mercer's house, written reminders referencing adjustments to the estate, and phrasing aligned with the language rehearsed on the video. The hospital attorney's posture changed as he spoke. Her back straightened a little more, her jaw set. Liability had stopped being an abstract word and started to look like faces on a printed page. The medical director glanced at her, then at the APS investigator, then at me. Martha spoke again, but some of the tremor had left her voice, replaced by something harder. "This is taken out of context," she said. "You know how people can twist things. I have been the one taking care of him. Where is he in all this? What is he saying?" The APS investigator looked at her, his gaze steady. "That is part of why we are here," he said. "To determine if he was able to say no, to determine if he was pressured when he could not." Martha frowned, eyes moving from face to face as if looking for an ally. The attorney picked up one of the still shots and studied it again, not meeting her gaze. The investigator closed his folder. "Based on what we have heard and seen," he said, "APS will open a full investigation into possible exploitation. Effective immediately, Ms. Ellison, you are suspended from caregiving duties tied to this facility and to Mr. Mercer. The matter will also be referred to the district attorney for review of potential criminal charges." The words were calm, almost gentle, but they carried a finality that settled into the corners of the room. Martha went very quiet. Her hands tightened just enough for me to see the knuckles pale. She did not cry now. She did not protest loudly. She looked at the table, then slowly lifted her eyes toward me. For a second, our gazes locked. There was no panic in hers yet, not shame. Mostly calculation, a quick assessment of the man sitting across from her, the one she had dismissed as too busy to be dragged into all this. The medical director cleared his throat. He spoke of hospital policy, of cooperation with APS, of ensuring patient safety. The attorney added a few words about internal review. It all floated around me like distant noise. In my head, I saw my father's hand on my wrist again, heard his voice asking me not to sign, heard the soft scrape of the pen on paper behind the curtain. Felt the weight of the little camera in my palm. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with chairs pushed back and papers gathered into neat stacks. People filed out, each carrying their piece of responsibility. I stood closing the laptop with a soft click and followed Malone into the hallway. We walked in silence for a few steps. The hospital sounds returned, carts rolling, monitors beeping somewhere down another corridor. A child crying faintly behind a distant door. Life flowed around us, indifferent to the small room we had just left. "That went about as we expected," Malone said quietly. I nodded. My throat felt dry. "She will not be near your father again," he added. "At least not as his caregiver." We stopped at a window that overlooked the parking lot. The sky outside was the color of old tin. Cars moved in and out their windshields, catching the dull light. I saw movement in the reflection before I turned. Martha walking down the opposite hallway, escorted by a staff member. She glanced over her shoulder and caught sight of me. Her expression did not crack, did not crumble. It only sharpened like a blade that had found a new edge. Our eyes met for a heartbeat. There was a question in hers now, maybe wondering how much more I had, how far I was willing to carry this. Then she looked away and kept walking, her footsteps fading into the general noise of the ward. I watched her until she turned a corner and vanished. Then I looked back at the glass, at my own faint reflection in the hallway behind me, folding into the distance. For a moment, everything went quiet inside, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from knowing the next part of the road has already begun. The morning of the hearing came cold and sharp, the kind of air that settles deep in your lungs and makes you feel awake whether you want to be or not. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment before going in, letting the wind move around me, steadying my breath. The stone under my hand felt colder than the weather. I told myself it was just another building, just another room with paperwork and people, but my body did not believe it. Inside, the halls were filled with muted footsteps and the soft rustle of coats. I followed Malone down the corridor, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in long, thin streaks. When we reached the probate courtroom, he pushed the door open and nodded for me to step in first. The room looked small compared to the weight it carried. A single window high on the wall let in pale winter light. The benches were almost empty. The judge's bench rose just enough to remind you where decisions were made and where you stood in relation to them. I took my seat beside Malone, hands resting flat on my thighs to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Martha sat with her attorney. She had traded her scrubs for a simple blouse and a neat ponytail, a look that seemed designed to disappear into the room. Derek sat beside her, his shoulders tight and his eyes darting around the space, unable to settle. I watched Martha glance once toward the judge's chair, then toward the door like she was assessing escape routes she no longer had. The judge entered with a quiet step, settled into his seat, and began reviewing the file. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had given up expecting surprises years ago. Malone rose calm and steady and laid out the case piece by piece. He spoke of the hospitalization, the timing of the supposed will update the caregiver's involvement, and my father's whispered warning that stopped me from signing anything. He emphasized what I already knew in my bones. A signature made under pressure is no signature at all. He asked permission to play part of the video. The judge agreed with a small nod. When the living room footage appeared on the monitor, the room seemed to tighten by an inch. There was no sound for the first few seconds, only the grainy image of my father's chair and the familiar old carpet. Then Martha and Derek walked into frame, folding the will beneath blank pages, rehearsing the words that would make it sound legitimate. Their voices floated low, matter-of-fact, each sentence a quiet cut. The judge watched without moving. The clerk stopped writing. Even the attorney beside Martha seemed to sink a little in his chair. When the screen went dark, the silence felt heavy and close. Martha's attorney stood and tried to reshape what everyone had just seen. He talked about context, about misunderstandings, about how caregivers often rehearse instructions to avoid confusion. He tried to argue the camera angle made things look different than they were. I watched his hands tremble slightly as he turned the pages on his clipboard. Malone did not interrupt him. He waited until the man finished, then asked the court to call their next witness. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, slowly feeling each step gather inside me. When I placed my hand on the rail, my fingers touched the cold metal and a faint tremor moved up my arm. The clerk swore me in. I said yes, but my throat felt dry. As I sat, I became aware of something unexpected. It was the memory of my father's eyes the last time he looked at me before the hospital took over. A steady look, tired but clear, like he was passing something across a silent distance. That memory pressed against my ribs as Malone asked his first question. I answered each one quietly, making sure my voice remained level. I told the judge what my father said behind that curtain. I told him about the clipboard, the refusal that came from a man too weak to raise his voice, but strong enough to hold my wrist. I explained why I walked away instead of signing anything. As I spoke, the judge watched me with a patience that felt heavier than sympathy. The opposing attorney tried too. He asked whether my father was confused at times, whether stress might have shaped my assumptions, whether years of distance between family members might have influenced my judgment. His questions pressed against me in small, deliberate steps. But the answers were the same. My father knew what he said. I knew what I heard. The judge looked down at his notes when I stepped off the stand. I returned to my seat, heartbeat loud in my ears. I could feel a bead of sweat at my collar despite the cold air. A young nurse walked to the stand next. She looked smaller than I remembered from the hallway video, her badge swinging lightly as she moved. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but the words came out clean. She told the court about hearing Martha and Derek arguing near the nurse's station the night before the will update. She repeated what she heard about getting it done before he was lucid again. She kept her eyes on the judge, not on the two people who had just learned her name. The opposing attorney pressed her too, questioning her memory, asking if noise from other rooms might have distorted things. She stood her ground. When she stepped down, she looked shaken but also relieved, like someone who had finally put down something heavy. When both sides finished, the judge leaned back silent for a long moment. The weight of the room seemed to press inward. His eyes moved from the video stills to the bank statements to my father's original will drafted years ago in Malone's office. His fingers tapped the table once. He spoke in an even tone. There was no drama in it, only decision. He found the updated will unreliable. He ruled it invalid due to undue influence and lack of capacity. He reinstated the prior attorney-drafted will as the controlling document, and he stated that given the evidence presented, the matter would be formally referred to the district attorney for further review of elder exploitation and attempted fraud. The words sank into the room slowly, like dust settling after a structure gives way. Martha did not look at me. Her eyes stayed forward, expression brittle. Derek slumped slightly, his jaw clenched tight enough to tremble. A man with a DA badge approached them near the door. He spoke softly, motioning for them to follow. They stood with stiff legs and walked toward him, their steps uneven. I felt no victory rise in me. Only a long, quiet release, the kind that comes after weeks of holding back a flood. It reminded me of condemning a house that had once held warmth, knowing you were doing the right thing even if it left an empty space behind. Malone touched my shoulder once, a small gesture. "You did right by him," he said. I nodded, but the words stayed inside me. Outside the courthouse, the cold air felt sharper than before, almost clean. Claire stood near the bottom of the steps, hands deep in her coat pockets. Her eyes found mine, searching for something but not asking for it. "Ready," she said. I let out a slow breath. "Yeah." We walked toward the parking lot side by side, not hurrying, not talking, just moving at the same pace for the first time in years. The cold air followed us out of the courthouse and stayed with me through the drive back to the hospital. It settled on my shoulders like something familiar, something I had carried for years without knowing its name. By the time I reached the parking garage, the evening lights were already humming against the concrete, and the elevator felt smaller than usual as it brought me up to my father's floor. The hallway outside his room was quiet, the kind of stillness hospitals only manage late in the day when the shift change has already passed. I stepped inside and saw Claire dozing in the chair by the window. Her legs pulled up slightly, her coat draped over her knees. My father lay under the thin blanket, a soft winter light spreading across his chest. His breathing was steady but shallow, and for a moment I thought that was all the room would offer me, a slow rhythm and a long wait. His hand moved first, a small shift against the blanket, then his eyes opened. They took a moment to find me, the way a man waking from a long sleep tries to remember where he left off. When he did, he looked at me without confusion. It was the same steady look he used to give me when I was a boy, and he wanted to make sure I was paying attention. His fingers brushed my wrist and held on, not with strength but with intent. His voice was raspy, almost a whisper, yet clear enough that I felt it in my chest. "You did not sign." I sat down beside him, letting the weight of that moment settle. There was a quiet pride in his eyes, something he rarely said in words even when he was younger. I told him the judge had settled the matter, that the hearing had gone our way, that he no longer needed to worry about papers or signatures. I did not mention the district attorney or charges or the words exploitation and fraud. He had lived through enough nights filled with bad news. He closed his eyes briefly, the corners tightening as he drew breath. When he spoke again, there was a tremor in his voice from both effort and memory. "She took your mother's ring." He said it like he had been holding that truth behind his teeth for weeks. I leaned closer, waiting, not wanting him to push himself. He paused in the middle of his sentence to gather air. A slow inhale, like walking uphill with a weight on his back. Then he told me how he had seen Martha slip the ring into her pocket while pretending to tidy the room. He was too exhausted to argue, too proud to call me, too wary to show fear. So he turned to the only thing he had, the little camera I once showed him on a slow, sunny afternoon. He used it to hold proof the way a man might hold onto a railing when the stairs shift under him. Claire had woken while he spoke. She stood near the window facing us, her hands pressed against the glass as if she needed the cold to steady herself. When our father finished, she turned back. Her voice was quieter than I remembered it ever being. "We both left you alone with this. Evan just stayed closer." She was not asking for forgiveness, and I was not offering any. But there was something in the way she looked at our father that felt like a thread being stitched back through time, pulling us into the same room for the first time in years. When the nurse came to check his vitals, I stepped into the hallway. The lights were dim and the floor smelled like fresh sanitizer. I pulled my phone out and called Malone, asking him to release the ring from his office safe so I could bring it home. He told me he would meet me early the next morning before his first appointment. His voice sounded tired but satisfied, like a man who had spent the day building a case brick by brick and finally saw the structure holding. I returned to the room just as the sky outside began to dim. Claire had drawn the blinds halfway and the light inside had gone softer, almost amber. My father drifted in and out of sleep each time, waking long enough to glance at the small frame on the bedside table with my mother's photograph. I wondered if he saw her face clearly or if he simply remembered it the way it felt to stand beside her. The next morning I stopped by Malone's office before the sun fully cleared the buildings downtown. He handed me a small velvet pouch worn at the edges from decades of being opened and closed. Inside was the ring, the thin gold band warm from the heat of his hand. I drove back to the hospital without turning on the radio, letting the quiet keep me company. In the room, Claire was reading a magazine she clearly was not paying attention to. My father opened his eyes when he heard my steps. I placed the ring on the bedside table beside my mother's picture, letting it sit in the pool of morning light. My father's lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that said everything without rising to full expression. "Now she can see you did right." He whispered it slowly, each word landing with the weight of years. I stayed there beside him, holding his hand, watching the sunlight shift across the blanket as the morning settled over us. The machines hummed in a steady rhythm, not intrusive, just present, marking time the way a clock does in an old house. Claire moved her chair closer to the bed and sat without saying anything, her hand resting on the rail just inches from his. The room felt different now, not lighter but anchored, like something that had been unsettled had finally found its way home. For a long while we sat in the quiet, the three of us, listening to the soft sounds of a hospital waking up for the day. Outside the window, a thin line of frost glimmered on the branches of a bare tree, catching the light in a way that made it seem almost gentle. As I watched the ring beside my mother's photo, I felt the last pieces of the past ease into place, not resolved but understood. The camera had captured what needed to be seen, but it could never record the part that mattered most, the part where a man decides who he will be when the world looks away. The light on the bedside table grew warmer as the morning deepened, and somewhere down the hall a door opened softly, letting in the faint scent of coffee and cold air. I let out a slow breath, the kind that empties a space inside you just enough to make room for peace.